So, the question that I would leave for you is, we've had 30 years in provincial Roman archaeology of the Romanization debate. That debate about what has the Roman Empire done for us? What has the Roman Empire done for the people of the provinces? To what extent is Roman imperial culture an evenly and consistently dominant force? To what extent is it negotiated? And if we remember that the Roman Empire is made up of hundreds of distinctly different peoples who might claim different tribal affiliations or ethnicities. There'll be dozens of different languages. We couldn't even begin to catalog all the different religions. All those variations are likely to have some influence on Roman culture. So how is that affecting our understanding of something as ubiquitous as the phallus, as a symbol, as an object that finds itself represented commonly throughout the Roman world? And so one of the questions that I had in approaching this research was the extent to which we should be accepting some of those models, some of those interpretations of what the phallus means from those early Roman sources. So because we have those cultures of newly incorporated provincial peoples who will have different family structures, there'll be different gender roles, they'll have different legal status amongst gender or adults and children. There's also all those peoples of the Roman Empire who were never, conquered or politically incorporated, the so-called barbarians, who are also adding another element of, of cultural diversity and influence in those contacts with the Roman world. There's also this question about the change over time, because that evidence that's been at the forefront is from the first century BC and first century AD. People often haven't taken a long-term view of the importance or possible changing interpretations of phallic symbolism. And then, of course, there's religion. So what happens when Christianity becomes dominant? We often think of Christians as being very prudish compared to, the Roman pagan cults. But is that the case on the ground? That said, we can't deny that the Roman Empire is an empire. It's a militarily dominant and dominating empire. And that conquest allows the Romans to very strongly enforce their culture and their view. Not only that, the way in which the Romans tried to incorporate new provincial peoples, particularly the elite of those provinces, was through, I suppose you could say, systematic acculturation and education. So those provincial elite, while they might be considered, yokels from the aristocracy of the city of Rome itself, were often being brought to Rome, and they were reading, classical poetry. They were reading the great works of literature. So they are being acculturated into that Roman mode of thinking. The other element, of course, here is the frontier. We can look in any of the frontiers of the Roman Empire, and we know that frontiers are very dynamic zones of cultural contact. And the communities that live in the frontier, whether they're military communities or even the barbarian communities or rural communities, are a bit more distinct from what we consider the kind of normal civic provincial societies and communities. So the frontier adds a whole nother element to this interplay. So if we take that phallic symbolism is found throughout the Roman world, okay, this is not something that's particularly unique to any one part of the Roman world and can be found quite frequently. For those of you who are not familiar with Hadrian's Wall, who don't live, eat, and breathe Hadrian's Wall, because I'm told that there are people like that exist. I don't get to meet many of them, but apparently they're out there. In case you don't know about Hadrian's Wall, what we have really here is a monumental complex with a very complex and dynamic history. It's built in stone across the narrow isthmus that separates the North Sea from the Irish Sea in northern England. And we have inscriptions that date the wall to the Hadrianic period. Along that complex, it's not just a wall. There's a whole series of different installations, different layers to the monument. So there is there's the bit that's the wall, but we often call the curtain. And so part of the reason I want to mention these is because I will use some of this terminology later, so as not to confuse you. To the north of the curtain, there's a ditch. And then to the south of the curtain, we have what's known as the vallum, which is another kind of a ditch flanked by two earthen mounds. So you've got layers here of linear elements: ditch, curtain, vallum. And then we have the installations that are built along the line of the curtain. So we have turrets, which otherwise can be understood as towers. We have mile castles, which are often seen as a fortified gateway. They occur roughly every Roman mile. And then, of course, we have the forts, which are the most sizable settlements and are the bases, the centers of those military communities, with soldiers certainly living inside the forts, inside the fort walls, but actually a much bigger, more diverse community consisting of servants and slaves, family members, women and children, also integrated into that community. So Hadrian's Wall is not just some sort of a hermetic community of militant men, where there's no women or children around. These are real, vibrant, mixed communities. And I think that's the other thing to emphasize, that we're not looking at a bunch of isolated soldiers with plenty of time on their hands who are busy scrawling a cock and ball all over everything. Okay, there's a real life and culture to Hadrian's Wall. And what we find when we do a survey of Hadrian's Wall is that there is a plethora of penis. You'll find them carved on stone, on bone, and actually, more excitingly, even recently, in wood. So there's no shortage of this phallic symbolism. So what can we say about the phalli of Hadrian's Wall? So like any good study, I traipsed myself to all the museums. I bothered all the curators with slightly odd requests via email saying I would like to look at their stone penises. And review their collections. That traveling back and forth across the wall corridor allowed me to catalog 59 stone-carved phalli. That's quite a bit for actually a really relatively small part of the Roman Empire. And I looked, to be fair, just within the confines of the World Heritage Site. So that's basically along the line of Hadrian's Wall itself, and west down the Cumbrian coast as far as Maryport in Senhouse Museum's collections. One of the things to point out is that amongst that total of 59 itself, that 13 of those phalli were found at Vindolanda alone. And when I will show you a distribution map in the next slide, but that distribution was very uneven. Almost all the carvings of phalli were found in forts. There are not any, so far I'm aware of, that were found at mile castles or turrets, but they are found at sites besides forts. So there are carved phalli at quarry sites where the Romans are actively quarrying stone to build or repair the wall. They're found associated with bridges and also along with the stone curtain of the wall itself. So it's not a symbol, which is a stone carving which is found exclusively at forts. The reason I pointed out that figure of 13 phalli at Vindolanda is really important because actually that allows us a little bit of a very rough baseline calculation. Vindolanda has been probably more extensively excavated than almost any other site along Hadrian's Wall. And that's not to say that there's nothing left to discover at Vindolanda. There's plenty left to discover at Vindolanda, but the very frequent and regular excavations means that actually these stone phalli, these stone carved penises, are very regularly encountered. So the fact that there are 13 of them gives us some sort of baseline. So if we assume an average of 10 phalli are likely to be found at any given fort or town along the length of the wall, then actually we can project that based on the number of forts in towns of 20 to be at least 200 stone phalluses. The fact that we don't have that many, there's only 59, means that we can very conservatively estimate that there's perhaps a 25% survival or discovery rate. So basically what I'm saying is that I think we should expect more of these to pop up over time, that there's more yet to learn. So, I've done a simple collation, simple mapping exercise, and you can see that right here. Now, I should also be very clear in indicating that phalli come in a number of forms. And so you'll find them in pendants, in amulets. And I focus very much on stone carved phalluses. So those that are, I suppose you could say, disembodied, that they don't have any other body or figural representation with them. It's just the phallus itself. The other thing to note is that I was counting the phalli as opposed to the stones found on them, because if you're lucky, your museum store has a stone which has multiple penises upon it. And actually there are some really quite interesting carvings in that regard, and I'll point these out a little bit later. But you can see from this distribution map in front of you that, Vindolanda, in terms of the number that it has, looms quite large. Corbridge also has a rather significant amount at 8, but that's partly because one of the stones found there had 4 on it all by itself. And that was from a burial monument, in fact. So, a single stone with multiple phalli on it can quite rapidly change your counting and change your tallies. What's interesting is where there appear to be gaps or breaks. So if we look at the west end of Hadrian's Wall, for example, we don't have anything west of Carlisle or even further down the Cumbrian coast until we get to Maryport. I suspect that absence is not real. The reason that there is an absence is because there's very little of Hadrian's Wall which is left upstanding west of Carlisle. And nearly all the stone has been robbed out to build other structures in post-Roman centuries. So short of farmers letting me go and deconstruct their barns and their farmhouses, there's not really much I can say there, but it's always possible that further excavations or a good house renovation will turn another one over. Now, is any good material culture specialist will do, if there's no existing typology, it's very important that you start a new typology. And so one of the side quests of this research was the possibility of creating a phallus typology. Now, I was astounded that no previous scholar had ever decided to catalog penises and give them a typology, categorize them based on their characteristics. But apparently this is something that other scholars thought was either unnecessary, or perhaps they weren't juvenile enough in their scholarship to their approach. So what I did was establish a typology, partly to give some sort of independence to the analysis, because having such a large assemblage of stone-carved phalli from Hadrian's Wall actually gives us a fantastic opportunity, because it's very rare to find, that many phalli from any one site. The only other site I can think of that could even compete would be Pompeii. So admittedly, I'm treating Hadrian's Wall as one site, but in terms of a unified monument, it means there's a very meaningful assemblage here. So the typology, which I'll go through very quickly, is based off 3 features. There's the execution, that's to say how it was carved. There's the proportionality in terms of length versus girth, I think is the only way to say it, looking for and trying to identify a more idealized artistic form. And then there's the overall shape. So I'll take you through those in brief. Looking at the execution, you have, at the time that I did the study, there was one example in sculpture. Actually, I now know a second example that's been sculpted. And when I say sculpture, I mean in 3 dimensions. You do get phalli in 3 dimensions, but often more as pendants, cast in bronze or carved out of bone or wood. But in stone, it's quite rare. More common are to find them carved in relief or to be incised. And you can see from that simple pie chart there that 2/3 of these are incised. I did a little bit of experimental archaeology, which is to say I had a stone and I had a hammer and chisel, and I tried carving a phallus myself. In about a half hour's time, you can knock out a pretty reasonable incised phallus. If you give yourself a full hour, you can actually carve one in quite low relief. And if you give yourself further time, you can make a much higher relief phallus. I never kind of went fully on to 3-dimensional sculpture because my stone carving skills aren't that great. But that's to say, these are a relatively easy object to make. It doesn't take, I have no formal training in stone carving. I was able to do this with absolutely no training. I just needed a hammer, a chisel, and a rock. So it's not the sort of thing that requires great artistry, if we're honest. And that in itself might influence people's interpretation or decisions about what I have to say tonight. Now, looking at the proportionality, the question here was, is there an ideal sense of form in the Roman mind or in the mind of the carvers? because if you look at Roman statuary, actually there is a very oft repeated size and scale of genitalia, such that in the Greco-Roman world, portraying men with small genitals was often seen as an ideal, because it meant they were not barbarous, that their mind in logic led the way, as opposed to their base barbaric passions. So that was a little bit of a question. Does that more modest notion of genitalia apply itself to disembodied phalli? This created some interesting methodological choices. As I started taking these measurements at various museums, what I noticed is that testicles, when carved in stone, are rather variable in size and even in placement. I hope they weren't judging from life models, because there were some very serious deformities in the Roman world if that was the case. But the testicles were skewing my measurements. There's no kind of polite way to say it. And so what I found is I was having to take two sets of measurements. I was having to take a maximum length and a maximum width measurement, which included the testicles. But I was also then having to take a separate set of measurements of the width of the shaft and its length, and plot those out to try and find some repeated and consistent patterning. If you look at the total width versus the total length, that's the kind of the graph in the upper right hand of your screen. You can see there's some clustering, but it's actually, it gets quite scattered the larger the phallus itself gets in terms of the total length and total width. If you remove the testicles from the equation and just look at the measurements of the shaft length and width and that proportionality, they actually cluster much more consistently and break down into quite simple ratios. And that is what the graph in the lower right is showing you, is those clusters. And because I'm a consummate professional, I gave those clusters of proportionality, very deeply meaningful intellectual names. And so when you're looking at proportions, you'll have phalli, which can be considered chunky, those which I considered mean. I didn't use the word average because I thought that might have other connotations, especially if we were talking about phalli. And then those that were deemed slim. And it was important to include that as proportionality, because proportion is not necessarily the same as size. You could have an extremely large phallus, but it was still slim in terms of its proportioning. So that was the second element of the typology. The third element was to then look at the overall morphology and shape. Now, again, using highly consistent and professional terminology, I wanted to make sure that anyone could use the typology actually without having to carry around a 100-page thick manual, as you will sometimes find with deeply detailed German typologies of artifacts. So I went with something which was quirky in vernacular English, but actually also will quite often physically describe what you're seeing. So I came up with 9 types. I'll show you some of those examples of those visually in the next 2 slides. But by doing so, I was able to break down a general shape. And what you'll find, and you'll see some examples of these in the next slide, is that type 1, the rocket, is the most frequently found. All those other types, the hammer, the kinky winky, the split cock, the pointer, the double dong, running hard, they all have very low occurrences. Type 8, the beast, actually, I didn't have any examples of here from Hadrian's Wall, but it's in the typology because there are examples from other places in the Roman Empire. And then lucky dip is one where there's effectively ambiguity, where you could interpret the carving to be either male genitalia or female genitalia. And I will point out an example that potentially could be considered that, though I went another typological definition. So there are these types, and these types can then be broken down with the proportionality as well. So what you'll see in that graph that's on the right there is that a mean rocket is the most frequently occurring carving of a phallus along Hadrian's Wall. But there are chunky rockets as well, and there are slim hammers. So there's any, these different factors can be combined in different ways, but it's that threefold typology tells you very quickly how it's executed, what the proportioning is, and what the overall shape is. And hopefully the shapes are very familiar. So if we start with the rocket, The way I would say that you can remember the rocket is if you can imagine a 4 or 5-year-old child drawing a picture of a rocket ship. This is basically what you've got, except you just don't have little flames coming out of the testicles. But otherwise, it looks like a rocket ship that could be shooting up, toward the moon. You basically have a straight shaft of oblong or triangular shape, and you have testicles located at the base of the shaft. And it often tends to be represented in what you might call a plan view, a top-down view. And you'll see there varying examples. Perhaps the most exotic of the rockets is this example here, which actually, instead of having 2 distinctly formed testicles, the testicles are presented as a pelta shape. So that's a little bit more high culture phallus, I guess you could say. Looking at the other types, I'm going through all the slides too quickly, double clicking, there we go. Looking at the other types, again, hopefully you can see that these are quite visually distinctive. So type 2, the hammer, you just have to imagine it's actually, turn it upside down and you've got a hammer. The testicles are a bit like a double hammerhead. The kinky winky, I think, is rather self-describing. It's not particularly straight. The split cock is usually just a simple triangular, open-faced triangle with testicles definitely splayed at corners. The pointer is similar to the rocket, except that it's kind of like a profile view, that the testicles are arranged in such a way that it's almost if you're seeing it from the side, as opposed to looking either top down or bottom up. If you then look at the double dong, I think, again, that should be fairly self-explanatory. The main thing here is usually it's just a single pair of testicles with 2 or more shafts emerging from it. And then the other one, the last type that was represented along Hadrian's Wall is type 7, the running hard. And this is a phallus that has whether bird or lion, but some sort of animal feet that allows it to run. Types that weren't found along Hadrian's Wall, the beast and the lucky dip. The beast would be something which combines the features of multiple animals. So it would be a phallus with wings and, say, bird legs. There might be a lion's tail, the end of the tail, which also might be a phallus. They're chimera cocks, I think, would be another way that you could call them. So they're the types themselves are meant to be visually quite distinctive, and hopefully by the name you can always think, oh, that's very clearly a kinky winky. The importance here now, though, of having typology is then to think we have a number of these phalli where we have the contextual information, where they're found. They're still in situ in some places, or if they've been removed, we have enough records to know where they were found and to be able to locate them in space and time. And so that allows us to use this typology to determine, are there any changes? Are rockets an early phenomenon, and then in the late empire, they go all kinky winky, for example? They don't. I'll give you a teaser there, they don't. But it's that in situ discovery and also retention. And so I'm just showing you a few examples. You get examples that are in paving stones as found in the Principia, the headquarters building at Chester's Roman fort. So effectively right in the central building, right at the heart of the fort, and also in stone that was incorporated into walls. You will see them as part of drains. So this photo here, you can see the phallus in the photo is part of a drain coming out of the Principia at Vindolanda, and it's still in situ to this day. This one here is another stone from Vindolanda, and that was said to be the cover of some sort of drain or possibly a cistern. Incidentally, this is one that I did consider to be a lucky dip because it could, as much as it could be phallic symbolism, you could make an argument that it's also vulvic symbolism as well. In the end, I didn't go with that ambiguity. I went with the fact that I think it is a phallus, but I'm just giving you an example there of where there could be ambiguity. The other realm in which you'll find these is the 3 images that are on the right, stacked in a column on the right, which are associated with watery or bath structures. So this one here on the top right is Chester's bridge abutment. This central one is the bathhouse, extramural bathhouse at Chester's. And this lower one is the late intramural bathhouse at Housesteads. If we look just, for example, at Vindolanda, where the most of them are found, I hope you remember I said that there were 13 phalli that were found there. Most, though not all of them, can be plotted on a plan of Vindolanda. But one of the important things to note is that while I can show you this, representative modern plan of Vindolanda, which put this way suggests that the phalli are all contemporary, and that's just simply not the case. The one that's found here, for example, is associated with Severan building, whereas the one that's found here, this is the drain that comes out of the Principia, the image I showed, the phallus I showed you just the last image, that is, that's more mid to late 3rd century. So even though we can plot locations of these from the one side of Vindolanda, that's not to say that they're always contemporary. And so there is a danger there sometimes when we plot these that we can overinterpret or remove important context. Overall, what I can say from Vindolanda, though this is the site that has the most phalli and even the most that can be located in time and space, is there's no clear apparent patterning for the site, but they are typically incorporated in walls or drains or otherwise pseudo-watery features. More intriguingly, if we look at the examples that are found in South Shields, there is a barrack which is built in the 3rd century. There's now a modern reconstruction of that barrack that you can see in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. The barrack in question, you can see an outline of the barrack at the bottom of the slide, the red lines pointing over at the left side of the plan. So it's this barrack here, built in the 3rd century. You have 3 stones that have a phallus carved on them. I hope that phallus is visible for all of you. So you've got this one on this stone here. That's a rocket. You've got a kinky winky here. These stones, in a split cock here on the right, these stones were all found mere meters from each other, built into the lower courses of stonework of this barrack. These 2 actually were built into the stonework and flanked the door into this barrack room. And this other one was built as part of the center of the wall. Now, what's important here is that these phalli would not be visible. They were, the carvings were put on the stone, carved into the stone, and then those stones were incorporated into the building of the barrack. So they weren't on display. Those broad faces with the carvings had other stones laid atop them. So because they weren't on display, the only people that would have known that they were there would be the builders. Now, it's possible that the builders were the very same soldiers that lived in those barracks, but we don't know that at all. We can guess at best. But this actually reveals a really important insight, because actually what it suggests and argues very strongly for it is that visibility is not particularly important when we're dealing with phallic carvings. Actually, the mere presence of those phalli might be enough. That there's a function, a use to them that doesn't require the ability to be seen. Another further intriguing hint at the use and interpretation of these phalli can be found in wall mile 49. Now, this is interesting for a couple reasons. At wall mile 49, you can see actually the center of the photo there is the fort at Bad Oswald. Originally, Hadrian's wall was built in turf there. And you can actually see the line of the turf wall, this low mound here, that would have continued this way. So originally, Hadrian's wall is built in turf. Later in the Hadrianic era, it's rebuilt in stone, and the line of the wall is moved slightly off the line of the turf wall. And when they rebuilt the wall here in stone, in these 3 locations, they added phallic stones into the actual south face of the curtain. Now you can visit the site today. You can go in and find them. They can be quite tricky to find. I'll caution you. They're surprisingly well camouflaged. You might even call them shy. So you have to know where to look, to be honest. But relative to what the Roman ground surface would be, these are positioned at chest height, chest to shoulder height of the average adult male. And intriguingly, in this case, those that are to the east of the fort at Bad Oswald point west toward the fort, and the example that's to the west of the fort is pointing east toward the fort. Now, some have suggested, maybe actually this is almost like signage. It's literally pointing you in the direction of the fort. I can't say whether that's true or not, but what's interesting is the fact that the phalli here are incorporated into the stone-built wall. We don't have that occurring anyplace else along Hadrian's wall, but in fact, there are very few locations where the wall survives to that chest or shoulder height. And so this might be a more common feature to Hadrian's wall than we appreciated. And we simply lack the existing evidence to document that. So I would like to make an argument here for a few key points that you can take away for the evening, and then we'll go into questions. The first is that I would posit that the phallus is a symbol that has a genuine belief. There's enough of these. They're quite variable in size. The largest one is actually on the quarry of Barkham Hill overlooking Vindolanda, and it's about 5 feet long. That's not necessarily a simple half-hour job to etch into the rock. That people are investing time in carving these stones, these phalli, and also placing them in structures. So that's the first thing I would ask you to take away tonight, that this is not just silly graffiti, that these are actually a magic symbol, a superstitious symbol. The second, and this is pointing back to that evidence from the barrack at South Shields, is that while there might be a carved phallus, it's not something that has to be seen to be effective, to be functioning or working. So it's a symbol in which there's some genuine belief, and it's not a symbol that has to be visible. The third fact is that by looking at where it can be found in situ, associated with bridges, associated with walls, associated with drains, is that we can see it has a functional use. It is correlated with other objects, other locations along Hadrian's wall. Not only that, that by the different in situ examples that we can see in place today, we can also date them to different phases. We can see a lot of them are from the kind of first phases of Hadrian's wall, the Hadrianic phase, but their use and execution continues throughout the life of the wall, with the latest definite example being from the internal baths at Housesteads, which date to the mid to later 4th century. And there's one of those phalli, which might even be carved or possibly reused in the early 5th century. What we'd start to consider the kind of the end of the Roman period, or the early post-Roman period. So as a symbol, it's not something which is confined to any one phase or period of Roman history. Now comes the kind of the big notion, and that's, what is a phallus for? It's argued from other parts of the Roman Empire, not least Pompeii, that a phallus is basically, it generates an anti-evil force field. It keeps bad luck at bay. And it can be done for various needs, sometimes by invoking humor, because laughter is some of the best medicine. But effectively, a carved phallus is, supernaturally cock-blocking bad luck in evil deeds. And that when it's being used along Hadrian's wall, you can see this anti-evil, this anti-bad luck force field being put to good effect. It's being used in bridges. We know that the rivers and waterways around here have very strong seasonal flooding. They do in this day and age, even when we have really good water management systems. Imagine how serious some of that seasonal flooding would be, in centuries past, when we didn't have, reservoirs and good monitoring systems. We can see it when it's occurring in bathhouses, again, to keep away possibly germs or illness, or just, people's malicious thoughts. But most prominently, I think it shows itself by being incorporated into the stonework of Hadrian's wall itself, that brief section in the Bradoswall sector at wall mile 49, that actually Hadrian's wall is not just a physical barrier, but at least at that location, it's being endowed with magical protection as well. And in many ways, what's intriguing is that instead of Hadrian's wall simply being a defensive barrier, it's actually a little bit more akin to, say, the wall in George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones. That it is a physical barrier, but it's magically endowed and charged at the same time. And so we can't separate the physical from the supernatural in ways that we often would do today. I will leave you there. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Lovely, thank you, Rob, so much. Maybe if people could unmute themselves quickly and give Rob a round of applause, because the silence of Zoom sometimes is a little bit. There we go.
Thank you, everyone.
Rob, excellent. Lovely. I think you heard a few of us from our unmuted Zooms over our appreciation. If people could quickly mute themselves now, that'd be great. Thank you. Thanks so much, Rob. Really interesting. We've got quite a few questions popped into the chat, but I'll just wait for those for a second, and I'll call upon those people in a moment. Maybe I could pass over to John, and John may have a question to start you off.
Okay.
Hi, Rob. Thanks. That was great talk. Very stimulating, I have to say, and one that I think probably has subconsciously occurred to us, this idea of pulling this imagery together, but just wondered why it never been done before. So congratulations for doing it, and doing it in such an entertaining way. It will definitely stick in our minds. Can I ask a question about who is likely to be carving these? I mean, most of the forts are going to be auxiliary forts, I would guess. And is there any evidence that they're learning this particular symbolism as part of their Romanization, and then when they retire, taking it back home with them to wherever it is they go to, the Danube or wherever? Or is this something that is only active on the wall itself?
There is, it's a great question, and the short answer is no, we don't know, but I'll try and address that as best I can. There's some very interesting associations that go on. So phallic symbolism is often associated with the Roman army in particular, and not necessarily given credit is a symbol that gets found in the civilian realms of the Roman Empire. You can find that Roman phallic symbolism throughout all the frontiers of the Roman Empire. One of the challenges for this research for me is that no one catalogs these consistently. It's really quite frustrating to say. It's a rather titillating piece of evidence that we all kind of can snigger and look at. It's amazing how often it's just kind of set aside or left buried in an archival report. When you talk to scholars, they can always name examples of where some are found, but people have not consolidated and collated all those bits of information. So in that sense, we've got another first for Hadrian's Wall, but it's not unique to Britain. What's intriguing is that the evidence that's been looked at so far for the Antonine Wall, for example, is there's not that many. There's a couple in Roman Scotland. There's a few more in Roman England. Hadrian's Wall seems to have quite a dense concentration, even to the rest of Roman Britain. That said, there's a lot of stone associated with Hadrian's Wall. So in terms of our canvas, in our basic template, there's a bias toward that stone preservation and stone use. And it's also, the long-term life of the monument as well. So I suspect that as a symbol, they're very strongly underrepresented throughout the Roman world. And that even in other Roman frontiers, because you don't have a massively long stone-built linear barrier, they're not as frequently occurring as perhaps they could be. The other aspect to consider is that many of these would have been possibly carved in wood. So, how many wooden door frames or window frames, had a phallus carved in them is kind of a threshold sort of protection, protecting a border or a barrier. And we don't have many of those remaining. Just wood doesn't preserve very well. So I suspect there should be a lot more out there. And one of the things which is intriguing was doing the research, there were more than curators also thought that they had. And so I remember actually quite starkly when I was in the stores at Vindolanda, that Barbara Burley had looked up on the catalog. We went and looked at the stone store. And while I was busy measuring those that she knew about, she was looking at other stones and saying, oh, wait, there's one on this one. Oh, hold on, there's one on this one. And actually those stones were often kept because of another piece of sculpture or an inscription that was on another face. And it just happens that there was a phallus that had not been recorded in her database. So, I suspect that if we were to go through all of our museum stores, we would find more of these. So it's not even that we have to dig more. We need to look more closely at the stonework we've kept. So in that sense, I would encourage any of you with access to museum stores, if you're not faint of heart and don't mind hefting a few tons of stone here and there, you might find something exciting.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Rob. We've got a few questions popped in, so if I call on people's names, and hopefully they'll pop up and be able to ask directly. Bill Moulton, are you still with us, and can we hear you? You've mentioned a couple of points around mythology and graffiti as well. I wondered if you wanted to ask a question for Rob.
Sure. I was wondering how many of these were just flat out graffiti rather than planned efforts. Also, I was wondering what myth supports the conclusion.
Sure.
Usually the myths and rituals are often related, so I assume there's something.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the graffiti aspect, it's undeniable that some of them could be graffiti. What makes that hard to credit is partly where you would expect graffiti to occur. So if we look in Pompeii, for example, where we have lots of in situ preserved graffiti, they're carved in walls, they're carved in plaster, they're at kind of sitting height or shoulder height. A lot of these phalli are not really conveniently located to be graffiti. And so if they are graffiti, it's someone who's been bored and should have been doing work, presumably quarrying stone or shaping stone, but is instead has carved a cock and balls on a stone. The other thing I would note is that often, while they can be quite hasty and crude in execution, a lot of them aren't. A lot of them clearly have been given time and attention to be carved in some quality, and that again suggests an investment there. That it's deemed acceptable because I think we can all agree that if a Roman soldier was wasting time, there's likely to be a centurion or officer somewhere who's willing to crack a whip. So we don't know that they're all carved by soldiers, but the fact that they all seem to have a broadly military structure association is suggestive of the soldiers being the primary carvers, at least along the wall. As for myths, they abound in the Mediterranean world. The adventures of Hermes, of Dionysus, Cupid, Jupiter, Zeus himself. Jupiter never seemed to see a woman that he didn't have to try and have sex with. That's very pervasive in kind of Greco-Roman mythology. What we don't have so much is the myth in stories of those provincial peoples and barbarian peoples that were in contact with the Roman world. And we can see hints of the phallus and the vulva having a symbolic role. There's all sorts of naked carved warriors that are found across Northern Europe, but the disembodied phallus does seem to be something that is disseminated with Roman culture, and possibly the military being one of those key institutions that allows it to spread out.
Lovely, thank you, Rob, and thanks for your question, Bill. Much appreciated. Thanks, Rob. Liz, is Liz Green with us still? She had quite a lengthy question in the chat. Liz, are you there still?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Liz. Far away.
No, I just was interested in a connection with the god Mars, because he was the presiding deity for the Roman military, and his symbol in Roman astrology as well as general iconography is a circle with an arrow pointing up, which is the one we now use for maleness. And I'm wondering whether there's an intent to invoke the deity by sticking all these phalli on the boundary walls as a means of getting the gods potency and power and virility. That's this issue of Mars keeps coming to my mind because it's basically that god that the phallus represents.
I would say that's entirely feasible. I wouldn't want to commit to it, if only because actually what is intriguing is how little invocation of Mars there is in altars and other inscriptions along Hadrian's wall. So it's not to say that there's no dedications to Mars, but actually he's surprisingly underrepresented in a body of inscriptions that's emanating from Roman soldiers compared to Jupiter, or even those gods, more provincial gods and native gods that are likely to have a Mars association or syncretization, like Cocydius, for example.
Yeah.
As I say, I don't want to dismiss it out of hand, because actually it's a very intriguing idea, and I can see visually what you mean with that symbol of Mars, and how that lends itself to phallic representation. I think, though, if we look at the archaeological evidence, while we're crediting, this particularly to the Romans, you have this kind of spread of that phallic symbolism, which is found throughout the Mediterranean world, and not just Greco-Roman civilization. Egyptian civilization has disembodied phalli. Sumerian civilization has disembodied phalli, and they don't necessarily have that Mars association. So I think it's something that's separate, but it's also something that could very easily be twinned and incorporated into that belief or worship of the god.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for your question. Lovely. Felix, is Felix Day with us still? Had some points made about symbolism, and properties as well. Talked a bit about Venus as well. So, Felix, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can, Felix. Fantastic. If you'd like to fire away, it'd be great.
Yeah, it's just a suggestion that obviously the phallus was used as, a graffiti symbol, but also it may have, I'm sorry, I'm really nervous. I'm not used to speaking out
That's
loud.
all right. That's all
No
right,
reason to be
Felix.
nervous. I've just given an entire talk about carved penises, so you can't go much lower than that.
So the fact that some phallic imagery was used in hidden places, that might suggest that it was used as a sigil, as a magical symbol, and that might link to the myth of the birth of the goddess Venus, who was obviously born from the castrated phalli of Uranus. So that might suggest that the Romans think that the phallus had divine power to bear deities, and that might be why they worshipped them so much. They might have thought of them as an iconography of the gods.
Yes, yeah, I take your point entirely. There is something very powerful in terms of that phallic representation, and actually your mentioning of Venus is really interesting. A colleague, Stephanie Haas, who also created a paper and published in the volume where this research is published. She did a bit of an experiment, actually, because she had a theory that part of the reason that phalli are so ubiquitous is because actually it's really easy to draw or carve a disembodied phallus. Whereas if you were to ask someone to draw or carve a vulva, that's a more difficult ask artistically. So she conducted an experiment and asked a number of people to draw a penis and to draw a vulva, and how to just kind of look at how they were drawn and executed. And then she also looked at representations in the ancient world. And one of the things that she made a very compelling argument for is that there is a taboo around naturalistic portrayal of the vulva. Whereas it's very easy to create, whether you call it symbolic or iconic or a simplified representation of a phallus, that's harder to do with the vulva. And actually vulvate symbolism takes much more ornate and metaphorical forms, using, for example, cowrie shells or lunate pendants. or figs, any number of objects really that are pseudo-vulvate, and that was the preferred choice of the Romans. And when you factor that in, what you find actually is there's this interesting pairing between pseudo-vulvate symbolism and phallic symbolism. And so while on the surface it looks like there's the Romans are putting their penises all over the place and they're completely ignoring the power of in symbolic power of female genitals, that actually they're not. They're often also present, just not in very large stone forms. They tend to be more pendants and in smaller forms. So there does seem to be this linking between the two. It's not that one is being forgotten. How we link that directly to the gods is really tricky. And I'm not I couldn't even possibly comment on that and the detail or thought that it really requires. But it's an excellent thought, Felix.
Lovely. Thank you,
That's
Rob.
really interesting. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Rob. And thanks, Felix, for asking your question. Much appreciated. Tracy Rabbiotti, are you still with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can, Tracy. Did you want to fire away to Rob?
Oh, hi. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. It was fascinating. Yeah, my question is that the relief style seems a bit more artistic and better executed than the incised sort of style. And is there a suggestion that there's an element of pre-planning and placement as a sort of fundamental part of protection for a building versus more maybe ad hoc carving for like superstitious reasons?
I think that's entirely feasible. I did toy with the idea of a more public-facing phalli, or one which had a greater social significance because of where it was located. One of the difficulties I had in trying to test that is that often the nicer ones that are carved in relief are the ones that do not have any context, and so I couldn't test that notion. The few that are carved in relief and are more nicely executed are in positions of importance. So in the flag in the Principia, the headquarters building at Chester's, for example, that the phallus there is in such high relief that it's a trip hazard if you don't know about it, and you could easily find yourself tripping over a well-endowed flagstone. The bridge abutment at Chester's as well has quite a substantial and high relief phallus, though it's not as artfully executed, for example, as the one on the stone from Vindolanda that also has the palm tree, or the one at Chester's, which is pointing toward a kind of pointy circular object, which might be a vulva. So it's an excellent idea. It's one that I would love to be able to test. Sadly, the nature of our evidence doesn't allow us to yet.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks so much for that question. Thanks. It wouldn't be a Tremontium talk without Ian and Avril asking a question, and they've popped one in the chat box. So if Ian and Avril, if you'd like to ask your question, that'd be great.
Hi, sorry, it's not a question, just a comment to the quarries at Vindolanda. I think there's one, I can't remember if I've seen it or not. It's about a foot high, I think. Am I right?
Yeah,
I
was going to say that the biggest one in the whole wall corridor is on the quarry face at Barkham, overlooking Vindolanda. That has the dubious honor of being the wall's biggest phallus. And it's one of the examples. What I didn't go into tonight is there are other interesting observations to be made. For example, is the phallus ejaculating? Do you have streams of fluid emerging from the glands, which a surprising number of them do. And I've not yet been able to work out if that means anything, or if it's just a little bit of extra icing on the cake to make them more powerful. But that's it. They're found at quarries as well.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Good.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And that kind of makes me think, with my role with the engagement stuff, maybe some kind of phallic trail along the wall could be could be set up where people can
just been
hunt
at
them
Chester's today. We're on holiday.
Today. I did rather cheekily suggest it to someone at English Heritage, and their response was that was not in keeping with their target audience of family engagements.
Oh, I think after tonight's talk, and obviously the proof of the pudding is we've got over 100 people here tonight. I think there's definite need for some kind of walk along the trail for hunting down various symbols. Anyway, Emma Bowie's got a great question linked to the symbol of the plough in agriculture. So, Emma, are you still with us?
Yeah, hi.
You are. Go on, Emma, far away.
Hiya. Yeah, Rob, forgive me, I'm just a second year university student. I'm reading Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, and in it she suggests that the penis could also represent the plough, and obviously the vulva is the furrow, maybe with agricultural, because of course the Romans believed themselves as farmers at heart. And obviously, as you say, it's got longer history going back towards obviously more Neolithic hunter-gatherer farmers. So I'm wondering whether it's got some kind of, rather than Mars, some kind of connection to that origins.
It possibly could, and I think there's in some cases stronger links in Greek culture in terms of linking a disembodied phallus as a symbol of fertility. What supports your argument, though, is the rather creative and often graphic language that the Roman poets would use in describing male and female genitals, and so they would use that analogy of the plow and the furrow, the sword in the sheath. There are others which are considerably ruder, in fact, but that language was found throughout Roman poetry. I think in the case of disembodied phalli, for the Romans, what's intriguing is that it doesn't seem to be linked to anything around fertility. As I said, that's much more kind of a Greek association. The Romans almost the Romans have a more militant use of the phallus, I suppose you could say, and it's much more of a shield than a perpetrator, if you want another phrase.
Brilliant, lovely. Thanks for your question, Emma.
It's a good thought.
Absolutely. And thanks, Rob. There's been loads of lovely comments thanking you for your talk tonight in the comments box. Lots of comments from around UK and abroad. I think if we could unmute everybody, if you want to unmute your microphones, and I think we should give Rob a resounding round of applause for his talk and for answering his questions. So thank you, Rob, and for sharing your work tonight with us, and stimulating kind of our juices and getting us thinking and asking questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'll leave you with a final thought that that someone commented about the sanctuary at Delos, where you have extremely monumental marble phalli that are kind of prominently part of a temple complex, and they're absolutely huge. In another talk, I have a slide of that, and it just makes me chuckle because I have this vision of something like that along the Antonine Wall or Hadrian's Wall, or what if Melrose itself was a center of some sort of massive phallic cult? What would the people think today?
It was the evil eye.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. A really good turnout, well over 100 for the whole of the talk, so much appreciated. Thanks again to Rob, and hopefully we'll see you all and some more next month.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
No worries. Thank you, guys.